Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us for today's webinar, Beauty in Architecture, the Role of Aesthetics in Building. My name is Claire. I'm the Deputy Registrar at the OAA. We will begin today's webinar by acknowledging the land on which we are meeting and calling in. For millennia, the place we call Ontario has been inhabited by Indigenous peoples and nations who have been stewards of the land and are deeply connected to its rich cultural and natural landscape. We would like to invite you in a moment of reflection to acknowledge our shared responsibility to address past and present injustices and provide space for Indigenous knowledge and worldviews to shape the architectural landscape of Turtle Island. Before we begin, I would like to share some important information just to ensure that we have an effective and professional webinar experience. Please know that the session is being recorded for quality and educational purposes. To maintain a stable internet connection, we have muted all participant microphones and disabled video feeds. We highly encourage you to engage through our Q&A window, so please do feel free to submit any questions that you have for our speakers. These will be addressed in the designated question and answer period at the end of the presentation, but please feel free to put your questions in at any time. Also note that the chat function will be deactivated following this introduction. For those seeking continuing education learning hours, note that the attendance is crucial. A minimum of 80% attendance is required for these hours to be accredited to your OAA transcript. And just allow us a few weeks for processing and reporting of these hours. Lastly, note that the presenter does not provide insurance, legal, or practice advice, and the OAA does not bear responsibility for errors or omissions in discussions during the webinar. For accessibility, we provide automated closed captioning services available in multiple languages to accommodate the needs of our diverse audience. And now I'm really excited to introduce our speaker for today's session. Please welcome Brian Hagood.
Hi, thanks, Claire. Thanks for that introduction. I am an architect in Toronto. I have a small practice with my wife, Charisma Panchvakason, and I also have a passion for aesthetics. And I'm very excited to give this talk. Our goal today is to understand beauty as a philosophical concept and talk about why it should matter to architects. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen. Okay. And I want to start by with this quote from Christopher Alexander. He is an architect, was an architect and the author of The Timeless Way of Building and of Pattern Language. He said, "Everything that we see in our surroundings, everything, either slightly raises our spirits or slightly lowers them." And I think that this might resonate strongly with many of you. It certainly does with me. Might even be the reason why you got into architecture, the sense that architecture does affect our lives, even if it's subtle. It is important. And I have this photograph of Michelangelo's Pieta here to say that in a lot of ways, this is how philosophers over the ages have talked about beauty, that it's something that can amplify your joys, and at the same time, it's something that can console your sorrows. It has that power to bring meaning to anything that it touches. And further to that, it is also something that is a shared experience. It's something that we experience with others and communally, and we'll be talking about that aspect of it. Okay, a couple of quick definitions. Aesthetics. Well, aesthetics is specifically a branch of philosophy that was established in the 18th century that is intended to explore the nature of beauty, and then also, looking at art taste, other concepts, and manifestations of those things. And then how we perceive, how we evaluate, and how we interpret our sensory experiences and the objects that are in front of us. And it's important to note that while we'll be looking at beauty, there are, of course, other aesthetic attributes. And whether or not beauty is the most important, of course, is up to the individual to decide. But the purpose of this course is to try to persuade you that beauty is of extreme importance to everyone and to architects in particular. So what is beauty? We'll be trying to define that. There's no one definition, but this is something that I came up to kind of summarize the view that I'll be putting forward. And that is that beauty is something that delights in its perception, again, through sensory experiences, and that it also reveals a value that is beyond or independent of personal gain. Okay, this is our course outline. We'll got to divide it into 4 sections. So first I'll be giving you a brief philosophical background. I will be mainly pivoting around Immanuel Kant and his work, the Analytic of the Beautiful from the Critique of Judgment, 1790, really is kind of the seminal work on aesthetics as a theory. And he was building on everything. His philosophy is within the Platonic tradition. And so this will be looking at Western philosophy in particular, broadly speaking, and then sort of Plato to Kant. We will then talk about how architecture is unique as an aesthetic, how it is separate from or distinct from film or music or painting. And for that, we'll be looking at relying heavily on the work of the philosopher Sir Roger Scruton, who only passed away a few years ago. And then we'll take those concepts and we'll talk about how they've been applied or handled in the modern age. So roughly, say, 1915 to today. And then just a few ideas about how we can pursue beauty as architects. I'll just conclude with those thoughts. Okay, so we'll get started here. With our philosophical background, we'll be looking at 4 different concepts. The first one here is beauty as a virtue. It's important to say that beauty has always been thought of as a virtue from the time of Plato until that idea has started to get questioned in the 20th century. But Plato thought of it as a moral good. And that idea of it being morally good went through the Christian era with theologians like St. Augustine, Thomas Aquinas. These are people who also wrote about beauty in the medieval period. And then all the way into the Enlightenment, when it went through kind of a secularization where what was always understood as good as a divine quality became something that was good in and of its own right, something that was connected just to our natural material world. And you can think that's of all the landscape paintings of the Romantic era. And then finally, once we exit the Romantic era at the end of the 19th century, people are starting to think, well, what are there ways in which maybe beauty is standing in the way of what is more meaningful? And just to focus on that concept and go back to Plato, Plato was very much an idealist, to remind you of his works. And his goal as a philosopher was to try to outline ways in which people could live a more virtuous life. And key to that for him was to elevate people beyond base needs, but beyond animal appetites, and to find that plane of being where meaning went beyond that. To him, that that idea, obviously, in the humanist uh, tradition that comes out of the Renaissance, um, is a very strong idea. And for Plato, beauty was a way to achieve that. He thought that things that were beautiful would help us get to that place beyond um, behind just being animals, let's say. And he had these ideas, what we now call the transcendentals of beauty, truth, and goodness. And he spoke about these as being distinct but related concepts. So it's a fair question if something can be beautiful if it is also a lie, and that this is from the very beginning of philosophers thinking about beauty. Um, this is implying that there is a rational overlay to our sensory experiences. So instead of something that just pleases the senses, say in a bodily way, like if you're going to a warm bath and the water just surrounds you and you feel the sensations of the water and that feels good to you, that beauty is something that can have that quality, but then goes beyond it, so that you're using your rational faculties to experience it. And you could even say that there are things that are just in the mind, like a beautiful idea, and that's its own interesting topic. Now, the way that we as architects have thought about, this should resonate. I think the idea that beauty is related to truth and goodness. It's something that percolates in the way that we talk about our work. Truth in materials, um, goodness in the function of the space, designing so that it works well is important. And something doesn't look right if it looks like it won't work well. And then ethical responsibilities, including economic concerns or sustainability. These are all mental, rational concepts that can affect the way that we experience things that we're, say, looking at. Another second philosophical concept to touch on is the distinction between what is real and what is ideal. And again, with Plato, he, as being an idealist, he took sort of an extreme stance on what was ideal and the value of that. And he had this, just to remind you, this idea of the realm of the forms, that concepts were the ultimate truth, and that everything in our material world was an imitation of that. And that, so this is a work from the 1960s where it's the definition of a chair, thinking about what that concept is. That's what that's a stand-in for. Then an actual chair that is, meets that definition. This is an instance of a chair. And then there's a photograph of a chair. And these are all chairs, but they're all different kinds of the same thing. And as I said, Plato had sort of, especially with art, had this extreme view that there was a danger with art being an imitation, that it might start to lose some of the truth of the concept. And that's, although that hasn't been helpful for artists as an idea so much, it's with architects, we think about this as well. You could think this is really what kind of being kitsch or pastiche might be fairly described as sort of design that is insincere in its presentation of what it is, where that idea of imitation is taken to an extreme case. Is this building beautiful? Or is it kitsch? But this certainly is a tension between what is, say, an ideal form and, well, we're working in the real world. What can be beautiful and what I can make in my specific site. Luckily, Aristotle, who is the pupil of Plato, and really had different, turn things around, had a different way of thinking about what was ideal. And instead of thinking about, say, forms per se, that there was some kind of ideal form that we were working for any particular thing, he thought about ideal uh, relationships. And this is where we get into talking about harmony, about parts that have a pleasing relationship together that then form a unity. And that unity is beautiful because of the harmony of those parts. And this is great because it really allows us to envision endless possibilities of different things coming to, and endless solutions that are infinitely beautiful, and adapted to, say, site, circumstance, culture. It sort of doesn't end. And architecturally, that's what the ideal. This is an image of the orders, classical orders. Um, and on the one hand, this, it depends how this is taught to you. You can mistakenly come away thinking, "Oh, the orders are very rigid," and this was a system that got rigidly applied to it, because it can seem that way. But in practice, the classical orders were organic when they were being made, and then sort of codified more of it as a documentation. Uh, but they were meant to be applied to buildings of all kinds of types, and they have been for hundreds of years. Um, this isn't an advocacy for classicism specifically. This is just an example of how, in the past, there have arisen styles of, uh, of architecture that have been successful because they have been adaptable to different situations, very different building types. Okay, disinterested pleasure. This term comes from Immanuel Kant's work, and it's one of those that needs some explanation, because by interest, what Kant meant was, not when you find something interesting. So we're looking at some people. I'll make up a story behind these people. They're looking at this art, they're really enjoying it, they're interested in it. But what he meant is in the sense of personal gain. They don't stand to gain anything from this painting. They don't have an interest in it per se. Uh, so they're not. They might be spending several minutes taking it in, but really they're contemplating it, and they're not contemplating it because they're going to put it to any use. Right? They're not thinking, where in my house is this thing going to go? They're not thinking, oh, when I sell this, how much can I sell it for? Or this would make a great tabletop. Um, they're merely taking it in, enjoying it for its own being, um, and then well, move on to the next thing that captures their attention. And art specifically is really great at displaying this principle, because it so clearly happens with things that we find beautiful in art. There is no practical purpose that we're planning that we want to put it to. And this distinction comes from Plato, the idea that there is certainly a pleasure that comes from the use of things, and when something is used well, if you have a bicycle that you just fly down the street, and you're really happy with that experience, and it feels great, and you love that bicycle because it is really getting you to work easier now. Um, but then if it's a beautiful bicycle, let's say, the feelings that you have towards its beauty is sort of a can be separated as a different experience, so that there is also a pleasure that comes just from the contemplation of something, for for what it is as we sense it, from looking at it per se. Or with music is also a great example. Music isn't something where uh, you can have a use for music, but often you're just enjoying it, um, just for the pure joy of it. And for Plato, this contemplative pleasure is the higher pleasure. Just to go back to that idea of beauty as a virtue, and that's something that can point us beyond um, our baser needs and appetites. That when we are engaging in something where we're taking this disinterested pleasure, we're actually starting to appreciate things as ends of themselves and not means to any particular end. And if you think about relationships with people, it's entirely the same way. So that if friendship, for example, sure, your friends do help you, but if you approach a friendship like that, uh, you're only someone's friend so that they will help you, that's obvious when that's happening, and they're likely not going to be your friend. That the value of the friendship supersedes any use that you might get out of it. And that's a good analogy for architecture, because architecture is a useful thing. We need buildings. That's why we have them. Although there are examples of buildings where we don't need them for a particular function. But for objects that, like buildings, we have these two things happening at the same time. So the next thing we'll be talking about is this idea of universality. So with beauty, often, the first thing that might be said in a conversation is that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And certainly it is. And it points to the tension that everybody feels. This is not an issue that will ever go away, about to what extent is beauty a pure subjective experience, and to what extent is it uh, objective, in the sense that the things that we're perceiving have qualities that we're responding to, that are the qualities in the object. And over the course of philosophical history, this has been sort of debated, and it continues to be. But at the time that we get into the Enlightenment period with Immanuel Kant and others that are writing about aesthetics, um, they're writing from a scientific viewpoint. We're into the scientific world at that point. They know that there's no beauty substance that's going to be found. It's not like you can measure temperature and weight or mass and volume. There isn't a specific thing that can be measured about something that's beautiful. It can be described, but even in the description, you're not experiencing it. If I describe to you the Taj Mahal, you're not experiencing beauty. You have to see it. And so what Immanuel Kant did was sort of convert the idea of objectivity to universality. And what he said was, yes, beauty is an experience that is in the mind, but it has the qualities of a universal experience, meaning that it is we when we deem something to be beautiful, we often judge it as though it were a measurable value, and we make a claim about it. We make a claim that we expect to find agreement on with other people. So that, you're looking at the Taj Mahal, you think, yes, anyone who is experiencing this building will also think that it's beautiful. And if someone were to say, no, this is a terrible building, it's ugly, if you felt felt like arguing with them, you might start to engage in a conversation about, well, why is that? Why do you think that it isn't beautiful? And the truth is, arguing about beauty is one of our favorite pastimes. We love to use our rationality, and that's because there seems to be something about us that wants to agree on it. And you can think that this is actually very similar to ethical actions, which have the same problem. They're not a measurable quality. So whether or not, if I have a dozen donuts out and there's four people who are going to eat them, if I eat four donuts, I've crossed some kind of line, because not everybody can have four donuts. I should only have three donuts, right? So I'm starting to give a logic to why I think that this action this ethical action is that way. And people do the same thing with beauty. And what can happen, what's interesting, I'm sure you've experienced this, is that these arguments can then change your mind so that you can be persuaded that what you might come in thinking, nah, I don't know about this, especially if it's something that's new to you. But then some say, no, hear me out. Here's why it is a beautiful thing. And then that knowledge, that rationality starts to change your experience so that the next time that you look at it, or if it's a song, if it's next time that you listen to it and you have this knowledge about it in your mind, you start to experience it as something that is beautiful. So that is, that universal quality is akin to how we might deal with measurable values using our reasoning. The other thing about universality, another aspect of that, is how social beauty is. We tend to make things more beautiful for other people. So, just think like if I'm going to a wedding, I'm going to dress up, I'm going to look nice, I'm going to wear. When I sit down to dinner, I'm going to be in my best behavior with my manners. I'm going to eat in a way that does not offend anybody. And this would be a different experience if, say, I was at home having like a burrito by myself. Would probably be, might be in my pajamas. I've got sauce going down my face. I don't care because no one's seeing. And what I would argue is happening in that moment, when we're with other people, is we realize that beauty has an impact on the people in front of us. And if we care about those people, which we don't even have to know them to care about people, right? Even the stranger, we will make an attempt to be at least civil to them, to show some grace through our actions. And we expect that of people, who we've all had like a terrible experience on the subway or something because someone's playing music really loud or they're telling off-color jokes and they're just making everybody uncomfortable. That's an example of manners as an aesthetic. That is something that with buildings too, we should take into account. Now, this, to go to the idea of objectivity, really isn't something that we'll ever escape. Even with the idea of universality, we'll always go back to, well, what is it about the object that everybody's having this universal reaction to, that people think is more beautiful, say, than something else? And this is an example. People have looked into this. This is Christopher Alexander again, who did a series of experiments with his students and in seminars. He would have images with two images next to each other of two similar objects, in this case, tools. But it could be anything. It could be hats, could be drive, could be salt shakers. And he would say, which of these two do you think has more life to it? And the purpose of the way that what he was trying to discover is to take beauty can be, we should all admit to each other, can be a kind of a charged term to use, again, because of that kind of universal claim aspect, so that when you say something is beautiful, you're sort of making a bit of a bold claim because someone might argue with you. And that's different than saying if you like something, because no one's going to argue if you like something. That's great. I'm sure you do. But whether or not something's beautiful, then maybe we'll have to discuss it. Anyways, his experiment was to say, well, what has more life? Another way he would say it is, if you were to die and come back as one of these objects and you weren't going to be used, which of these objects would you like to be? And he found just incredible agreement among people that it was always clear which was favored. In this case, the axe is the answer of what you would want to come back as. And then what he did as part of his work was to try to discern what geometric qualities are present that are creating this life-filled quality is what is the term that he used, sort of a proxy for beauty. And I won't go into it, it's very interesting. This is from The Nature of Order, first volume. But he felt that he found certain geometric properties that were more prevalent, not all at the same time, but were there when to help things feel more um, beautiful. All right, we're going to leave the philosophical background, and we're going to talk about architecture as a specific um, and unique aesthetic. And what I mean by that is, how is it different than watching a movie? How is it different than going to a concert? How is it different than looking at a painting? All of these experiences are different from each other, and they all have different implications, potentially, on what that thing should be like, because we're experiencing them in a different way. And as I mentioned, the philosopher Sir Roger Scruton, he talked about it. He talked about architecture being an everyday experience, and we'll go into the qualities of why that is. But if you think we're thinking it's that buildings arise from, as I said before, primarily they arise from practical necessity, something that we use on a daily basis for the, for the very most ordinary things, or even say most extraordinary things, and that the, their effects therefore are subtle, but in the aggregate, significant. And for him, buildings were more like manners. That if buildings are sort of like features, like a people, you interact with them almost as you do with people, um, and that you, just as I was talking about, being on the bus, when you're among other people, uh, and it depends on the context, but say in a public context, and we're talking about facades, you have a similar expectation for how a building might look to you. Does it need to be silly? Does it need to be loud? Um, it's kind of like manners. It's also important to note that buildings are primarily in the background. It's, uh, they are a backdrop to life's activities. That there are, well, now while there are feature buildings, and this is St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, we're looking down the avenue towards it, but the feature buildings that are in our built environment are the tiny minority, in that most buildings are either supporting them, in this case, down the boulevard towards it, or just ordinary buildings on ordinary streets, and that they therefore have have different expectations for those buildings, which are feature buildings versus supporting buildings. But even the feature buildings are experienced in the background. Um, Primarily, this building you see all over the city, and if you live here, you coming past it all the time, especially from the outside, speaking mostly from the outside, uh, um, that you can't escape this quality of buildings being part of the background to our lives, that we don't give it. Another way to talk about it is that we don't give it our extreme focus. Rare is it that a person will sit and just look at a building. um, that is how we watch films. That's how we read books. That is sometimes how we listen to music. You go to a symphony, you sit and you pay attention. And when we see paintings, often but not always, uh, we're giving something our full attention. Buildings, rarely are we doing that. They're simply in the background. Buildings are fixed and they are public. And this means that they have an immediate context that is also often fixed in public. at least on the outside. Let's see, once we get into the interiors, the discussion can change a bit, but even there's always a potential, depending on what the building is. The function might change. It might become something that people are coming into. But they do have this public-facing aspect to it. And, it's not like a painting. You can't put a frame around it. You can't show it in one gallery, go to another gallery, and expect someone to have a similar experience. Buildings, rare is a building that moves. And, that means that, again, this idea of what people expect from it, and how it should connect to its context, is very much is integrated into its context. And another aspect of this is that people, almost all people, especially on the outside of a building, will interact with it without any knowledge of the specific design intent. We'll talk about this subject about the artist's prerogative later, but it's not like you go into a gallery, you see a painting, so you might see something, you don't understand the symbology, but you've got a placard, it gives you the context, you read it, again, you're having a sort of rational overlay of experience. You then look at it, and then you can think about it differently, and that may or may not help you achieve, think of it as being beautiful. But with many things, there is that opportunity. But with buildings, even prominent buildings, what is the expectation that the public will be educated on what they are, and that this means that the building really should be able to speak for itself, in a way that you might have a different expectation for a different art form. Beauty is long lasting. And we think of this as a goal, obviously. We want our buildings to last. It means that they'll be more sustainable. Um, so buildings, that also means, depending on the length of time, that buildings will change function. They often do. This is Soho in New York. These buildings, a lot of those buildings, those cast iron facade buildings, were built as factories, which is sort of amazing to think because they're so beautiful. And then I worked on a project that had become a karate studio, and then someone had bought it and was making it into their apartment. And who knows what will happen in the future to become an office. What makes these buildings special isn't their function per se, but how they look. This is a quote from Roger Scruton. Aesthetic value is the long-term goal, utility the short-term. Nobody wishes to conserve a building if it does not look right. But if it does look right, someone will find a use for it. You could start to think, well, are there stylistic implications? Again, this idea of context, but also, it's especially for modern architects, we'll talk about the idea of zeitgeist in a little bit, this idea of speaking toward the times, as though an aesthetic can do that. How important is that if this building will be indefinitely present, and that people that experience it may have no, when do they know when that building was built? How relevant is the zeitgeist today to what the zeitgeist might be tomorrow? It's also a point to reflect a little bit, to remember, learning from Las Vegas, Robert Venturi, and his co-authors. He had this idea of buildings are either a shed, or a decorated shed, or a duck. And the thing just to underline here is that most ordinary buildings are like sheds. They're sort of built with a spatial configuration that is straightforward, easy to construct, adaptable to other uses, responds to all the things that buildings should respond to. And then, traditionally over time, They were then made beautiful through a layer of ornament, decoration around it. And this shed is actually right behind the duck. You just can't see it because the duck is too big. And it's kind of a nice shed. It has all these little bits of decoration on it. Um, and that's in contrast to, say, a duck. A duck would be a building that's overall form, its spatial configuration, is driven by this expressive idea. In this case, a duck. But many buildings are like that, especially high-profile buildings. There is a artistic idea that is driving the partie of that building. Um, and I guess the thing to say is that with those cast iron buildings in Soho, often the decorated sheds are the things that are more adaptable, right? They can be used. They're a little easier to get different functions in. Ducks a little bit less so. However, it's interesting to think about um, how if a duck is beautiful, how people will still um, find a way to use it. This is a modest example. This is an old theater on Bloor Street in Toronto, in the Runnymede neighborhood, that's been turned into a Shoppers. And some ways, there's decorated shed and duck aspects to it, in the sense that the facade is kind of a straightforward facade. It's organized in a way. It's got these bays, windows. There's a scale to it that can be adapted to. You can imagine many different things happening behind this facade. It responds to its immediate context in terms of scale. Um, but behind it, you get a sense of it with the roof. It was a theater, so it had to have a certain form to accommodate that. And the interesting thing is, it really is pretty spectacular in there. I tried to capture it with my own photo. Um, the it's the ornament that's doing it in this case. It's so beautiful that a corporation that has this space kept it and was okay with inefficiently using that space. They didn't build a floor in. They're okay to heat and cool this space. They want to preserve this building because it's so beautiful. It is the nicest Shoppers I've ever been in. Okay, this will be our last um, architectural as a unique aesthetic um, aspect. But we should remember that buildings, until recently, and still in much, if not most of the world, is a vernacular endeavor. And that means that these are ordinary people that are typically building it. So often vernacular styles, and even the classical style that we were looking at before, um, are ones that are easy and repeatable, um, able to be used by laymen to create what then, when you look at this as a village in Turkey, is places that people want to go and tour and think of as beautiful. And that, often it's as Christopher Alexander's observation, seems to be generated through an organic process. But even, in the age of architects, this is from the 19th century, architects would lead the way um, by through pattern books. So there's this proliferation. This is an excerpt from one of Asher Benjamin's, where he has a simple design for a fireplace, that this is enough information for a carpenter to do it. And it would be, a pretty nice one if they did it. The architects can use their knowledge if they're creating um, styles in a way that people can imitate. If something's a hard style, you can think of, many minimal buildings are beautiful, but when they get in the hands of a lesser architect, it's harder to do. One could argue there's less to work with. Maybe it's just a boring building all of a sudden. That's sort of the tension that I'm trying to point out. Okay. As I said, we'll be looking at architecture in the modern era, like I said, roughly World War I and after, and how these concepts have been handled. This is the Bauhaus. Um, we'll be talking about first idea is zeitgeist, and that is the idea of something that Hegel in the 19th century really pushed for, that art reaches its highest expression when it reflects the cultural, intellectual, and essence of its time. And when we get to the early 20th century, people are thinking about the machine, about industrialization. But there also, what's happening at this time too is this idea of progress, sort of a Marx idea that class struggle and material conditions are all sort of driving us ever towards a more just future. When you have this recipe of it's some explanation for why there was such a break with history at that time. There are other factors, but it just seemed like the past, to many architects, the past was holding everyone back, and that you just had to find something new. Now, of course, it presents some problems. These are all buildings that were built roughly around the same time in that early 20th century. They're all European architects. At the upper left, that is in New Delhi, and these are all in Europe. They're all very different from each other. So, which style captures the zeitgeist? Is there a style that can do that? Um, what other things are there? Cultural context, for example. Also, a problem dealing with revival styles. And what's true is that people throughout history weren't squeamish about reusing historical styles. We are now, or at least architects are. But this is the Ontario Legislative Building. Is this building ugly? I wouldn't say that. I don't think most people think that. Is it a failure because it's using a historical style? Um, it, to what extent people seem with many different aesthetics, but you could argue with architecture specifically, maybe because it's so long lasting, that there has been a high tolerance, or that's the way to talk about it, for people wanting a continuity with the past. Really, until we get into the 20th century with architects specifically, really breaking from that idea. Okay. Functionalism. So what we have happen, if you remember from your history course, is that although there were many different styles that we were looking at photos, there's brick expressionism happening in the early 20th century. There's Art Nouveau. There's Frank Lloyd Wright, his kind of idiosyncratic style. People are breaking with history, but they're maybe still using ornament to accomplish something new. Out, though, comes from the forefront this idea of functionalism and its companion, minimalism. You've got that form follows function. You've got Adolf Loos writing ornament and crime. And the main idea is that the spirit of the age was material progress, industrialization, and increased assets and utilities that came from that. And that people felt like the proper way to turn that into an aesthetic was to have that kind of streamlined efficiency there as well. And that ornament was counter to this, that it was superfluous. A very strong idea. Obviously, it's still with us today. But it also brings up some, interesting problems to resolve. And that is that, yes, while industrialization has brought efficiency, it isn't clear that the goal of efficiency is ever greater utility. So if you think of, all the vacations that you've taken where you've flown across the world or something like that to go somewhere, often what we do with our material progress, say jet planes, is we're not shipping, yes, we're shipping more products around, but we're also using that just to experience, say, a beach for for no purpose other than enjoying something, and often something that's beautiful. So that we can use technology to increase what we think is beautiful. This was happening in the 19th century. This is a house, Queen Anne style house in the United States. All these things were probably ordered. A lot of the decorative millwork that you see was ordered from a catalog, made in a factory and then shipped on a train and then picked up in a cart and put over here and put together by somebody. Also, the question of which function. Buildings have lots of functions in them. And maybe you admire this building, but it would be hard for every building to look like this, certainly. And I don't know that maybe you think this is beautiful. I don't know that everybody would think of it that way. That doesn't mean it's not a strong idea or a building worth doing. I'm not going to comment on that. But what it does, interestingly pose the question: well, what functions of a building should be seen? And it speaks to the idea that often what makes a building beautiful to people doesn't really come from the function. It often comes from other formal aspects that seem to be independent of it. So this is a building in Germany, which I picked because it is highly ornamented, starting at the upper left, and then going through a Photoshop exercise, removing the bits of ornament until you arrive at something that in some ways looks like something you might see somebody do today. And you ask yourself, at what point does this building look right to you? And as an architect, you're likely to have maybe you're a little bit further down the line, as if you can imagine ordinary people in your neighborhood, where would they be? Maybe it's not at the extreme, maybe that's too much, but is it at the totally denuded facade? I don't, you can answer that question for yourself. And then finally, this when we talk about modernism, there's this prevalent idea of the architect as having the artist prerogative. And it's certainly true that, post-romantic era, but even, art has become increasingly seen as an individual endeavor, and that the artist, the best artists are geniuses. They have a special power that they can either express themselves or grab something out of the zeitgeist, and through their faculties, they can find a way to interpret it for us to experience. And, being an artist is a very personal thing. It's expected of you. And architects, with the rise of architecture as a profession, with the idea that there is a person that is in charge of the design, as opposed to it being, say, an emergent aesthetic, as it clearly was at other periods in history, at least for most buildings. There's this idea that the architect wants to also be the artist, that the architect has ideas too, and that those are important to get across. This is the Ram crystal in our own province, and then the Jewish Museum in Berlin. Same architect, Daniel Libeskind. He had very different ideas that he used to generate them. So with the Jewish Museum, this rare instance of an architect being forthright about trying to deliberately create a building that made people feel at unease. You think, okay, maybe, I guess, it's dealing with a tough subject in Germany. Maybe there's some credit to that. But then, for the crystal, his idea had to do with the gem collection that's there. An ordinary person looking at this is very similar buildings, right? And they're both very harsh aesthetics. How much does that idea get translated, and how much of value is it to the people who have to deal with this thing on a day-to-day basis? Is a bit of an ethical question. And it's not to say that buildings have dealt with tough subjects in the past. But to go back to the idea of the Pieta, something that this is an ossuary, collection of bones as an entombment in Czechia. There's other examples. Maybe you've been to one. It is bizarre because we don't really do this anymore. Um, but this is about death and suffering, um, but it's been made beautiful. It's kind of like, to our modern eyes, maybe kind of a strange way. But look at and also think how it is on the exterior. This isn't a building that is, the seeing of the suffering part is happening inside. You're allowed through. You know what you're getting into. I think at that point, there's on the outside that's, there's sort of a modest, very nice facade, a little plaza. It's all set up very nicely. Okay, getting close to the end. Pursuing beauty as architects. So these are just some ideas for how these philosophical concepts can be implemented as an architect. The first thing to say is that, for any particular site, you have the ability to try to discern what people would like. What people have aesthetic preferences. One shouldn't start there and understand that. And they're pretty, I don't think it would be fair to say that they're not well formed. I think people do know what they like. And there are maybe two groups. There are the people who will be using a building, at least initially, and they will have thoughts, especially on the interior of a building. And then there's the people who will be viewing it from the outside. And who's the best proxy for that? You could start with who are the existing neighbors, right? What does the neighborhood think about what is the most appropriate building being put into their context? And people do this. They make surveys. This happens to be one that I did because I helped lead a community organization, and we were talking with architects about a building they had proposed, and I had made a survey. I sent this out to over 100 people in my neighborhood. I put these 6 images. A lot of these are buildings in Toronto, and I asked them. I said you could pick 2, and you can see what people clearly have a preference for. This replicates when this is normally done. And this can be almost any place or neighborhood. Usually people are liking traditional or ornamented designs, and the more stripped down stuff they like less. Interestingly, when you run this in reverse, architects tend to have the opposite, and there's this disconnect that happens. And it's actually been looked at it in school too, where they look at students who start architecture school. They tend to have the same views about buildings as their peers. By the time they're out of architecture school, they have very different feelings about what buildings are best. And this is, I should say, this isn't to say that obviously people do. There are many modern buildings. This isn't the case for traditional styles per se. This is to say that it is true that there are many beloved modern buildings. Like, for example, the Sydney Opera House. I don't think there's anybody who doesn't like that. And there are many others. And when those are looked at, I think they are the ones that stand out. And do they, making that for an ordinary building seems to be more difficult to do well. Might be one critique that I would offer, but it doesn't mean that there aren't beautiful styles or new creative things that people can do that people won't like. But maybe it's worth seeing if people like it. So if you generate something that you think people will like, if you think it's of value to see if they will like it, then show it to them. See if they do. The other thing I would say is that this has to do with Christopher Alexander, who I've mentioned a couple times in the presentation. He had this idea, maybe you read The Pattern Language back in school, or The Timeless Way of Building. Just to refresh you on that, he had this idea that of patterns, of architectural of solutions to architectural problems that are developed over time, although you could come up with one yourself, anybody could potentially invent one, but that we already have a wealth of information at our fingertips through buildings that are already known to work really well. And that you can use that as a language. You can talk about patterns. This is a pattern for a courtyard. He talks about the things that he has found through his research project that make a small courtyard work well. And that you can use that as a way of talking to your clients or talking to users or talking to community members about what are the priorities of what and how do things work well, what's been proven to work through observation. um, and that might give you a leg up, might make your conversations easier with people because you have this sort of common way of speaking about it, but also might help you convince uh, your client, let's say, for prioritizing things that might ultimately point towards a more beautiful building. And then this is just an image to say too, this is a building that just went up recently in Tribeca in New York. Um, it's very pretty interesting building. It is using ornament in a way that's new. It is alluding to Art Deco. They worked with a manufacturer to come up with with products that could be built at a certain scale to bring down the cost. And they went bold, and that's certainly something that isn't always going to be available for every project. But it's certainly possible to envision styles that people might actually, um, ordinary people might like, that haven't been thought of yet, or build on previous styles that are new, and that people will really will think is beautiful. That concludes the presentation. I've got, anyone who wants the deck, it'll be made available to you. I've got a short reading list of things I've referenced. I've got contact information. I have a little plug for my Substack. It's called Believing in Beauty. I write about every month um, an essay on this subject. I've got, just image credits there if you want to go look at these things in more detail. And then I guess we'll just at this point go to our question and answer period.
Thank you so much, Brian. That was such an interesting presentation and some beautiful images and thought-provoking ideas. So I think Ashley has a couple of questions. And again, while we ask and answer those questions, if anybody else in the audience today has a question, just see your Q&A button and you can type in your question, and we would love to hear from you. We've got a little bit of time left, so please think of your questions. I'm sure there's lots.
Okay, thank you again, Brian. Really good presentation.
You're welcome. Thank you.
First question for you. Can you explain what building features qualify as ornament?
Yeah, that is a bit of is almost like a spectrum of what you could call as ornament. And, one way to think about it is it's a part of a building that, strictly speaking, isn't necessary. What is that? And it's true that a lot of what is ornament, so the images that I was showing before of a building where I photoshopped off pieces of it, often are tied to what would be called integral features of a building. So like the sill of a window, how expressed is it? If you have a roof, if you have the eave of a roof, let's say that you want an eave to keep the water off, so you've decided for practical purpose to extend it beyond the walls below. Well, whether or not you have moldings, and if you have brackets, those are really elective choices. And so that those features start to become more clearly ornament in that way. And sometimes a distinction is made between what is decorative and what is ornament. And this is really where you're sort of picking a term, but that you could say, for example, that something that is a true ornament versus decorative, or vice versa, would be something that's sort of placed on something that is being held by the building, at the most extreme case, is something that's purely just applied. If you think of like on the pediment of a Greek temple, or Roman temple with statues being placed on it, that would be sort of the most extreme form. And maybe the most minor form of something would be turning a brick to make a brick pattern where, well, there's no practical reason to turn that brick. You simply did it because you thought it looked nice.
Thanks. My second question for you is, I know a lot of philosophers discuss the sublime as distinct from beauty. So what are the differences that they noted? If you can explain
Yeah,
that one.
sure. That is true, especially at the beginning of aesthetics as a distinct philosophical branch. People were very interested in this idea of what the sublime is, and what they were trying to point at was that we have these experiences where beauty maybe isn't the right word, but it seems akin to beauty. So if you can imagine, you drive up to the Grand Canyon, you're staring into it, you feel this sense of awe, and this sense of awe feels a little bit different than when you're looking at a beautiful painting. You're still contemplating it. And one way that I believe Kant would talk about it would be that there's like almost an infinite nature to this, so that you can't even quite conceive of where it begins and ends. Whereas things that are beautiful, we tend to understand as a unity, as this beautiful building is this building. But like say like a sublime landscape, it sort of overwhelms you. Like if you've ever been out on a clear night in the middle of nowhere and you get a good look at the stars, it's overwhelming. It is beautiful. It's also sublime. It just sort of sparks this contemplation of the infinite. Be a good one way of describing that.
Yeah, I'm not seeing any questions come in, but I do have my own question from a non-architect, and I'm sorry to all those in the audience who this might be a really basic question, but I'm curious about how much beauty comes into play when you're dealing with clients and when you're actually working on a project. How much does the concept of beauty really come up, and are there any specific examples where you were having to think that through, or there was tension there in the project because flashing views of what that meant?
Yeah, I think that it really varies depending on who your clients are. And I work in residential, so I'm dealing with clients who own their own homes and are renovating or building them, and their vested interest in the project often translates into high concern for the way that it looks. And that's partly why I enjoy it, because they really do want it to look beautiful. And in terms of what difference there might be between, say, us and what our clients are looking for, to some extent it's self-selecting. So they, if someone's picking an architect, they'll often be looking at what their other buildings look like. But then it is always a dialogue, and it is always an opportunity. I think every architect would agree to educate, to persuade, again, using rationality with people, to persuade them that what they're designing is attractive, is beautiful. And I hear, people who deal with, I think that architects that deal with institutional clients or developers have a harder time, because it's not always clear that aesthetics are a major concern at all. Unfortunately, in a lot of those cases, and and what might be something to say about that is they're often coming in from the point of view that they're not there to present the aesthetics. Say a developer. This is a conversation I actually had recently with a developer about this idea, and he said, it's been his experience that they assume that the architect has good taste, and that they will provide a building based on what they've already done of a certain kind of look, and that they're not going to fuss too much with how it is, except, and every architect has had this experience, where cost measures need to be taken, and that is sort of the sore thumb for so many architects, is that beauty starts to get these features start to get cost value engineered out. And what I don't have a great solution to that problem. It's sort of other than to suggest that if you can demonstrate that what you're presenting is actually valued, say you go to the trouble of doing a survey, say it's a condo building, and you do work with the neighborhood group to find a facade style that people really like. I mean, my experience has been a lot of complaints are just about how buildings look at these meetings. And so even if a building is how many stories it is sort of a separate conversation, but the fury often is just, I don't want this ugly thing in here. So if you can go to your client and say, look, this thing is just going to be easier if we're doing it this way, that other people, that people think is beautiful, I think that can be a tool.
Yeah, that's true. I think being a resident of Toronto, we see a lot of condos going up that probably don't align with our definition of beauty. But I've seen some good questions come in, so I'm going to ask you the first question from an anonymous attendee who wants to know, out of curiosity, do you have any thoughts or opinions on Thomas Heatherwick's comment on Le Corbusier? Le Corbusier is responsible for architecture's global blando.
Yeah.
Hopefully I remember. I like that term, blando.
Yeah, I've read Heatherwick's book, Humanize. I don't remember that comment specifically, but I think it's true that Le Corbusier was the most influential proponent of functionalism, and really influenced. All these guys knew each other, Adolf Loos and Walter Gropius, and Le Corbusier was, I think, sort of seen as the most intellectually persuasive of that group. Now, what's interesting is a lot of his work isn't functional per se, and it's probably his most, Ronchamp Chapel, people really like. That isn't one where you get a lot of public. If you survey people, that is one of those modern buildings that people really do like. And his most successful buildings tended to be ones where he sort of abandoned this idea of hyper rationalized buildings. And there are these funny examples. I don't remember if Heatherwick talks about it. I can't remember what of an apartment block that Le Corbusier designed, where the residents over time have just really changed it. So it's like they've put shed roofs on and they've created new windows. It's really doesn't look like his plan because they didn't like it. And they altered it over time.
Yeah, interesting. So we've got another question. Maybe a more of like a argumentative stance, a positional stance from fellow Goldsmith. And he starts by saying, ornament is not just unnecessary added decorative features, but in history also an element of style. Styles in history are tied not just to art, but statement of culture. Can you please talk about this? Why is our period so rootless? Well, that's a heavy, deep question.
Well, I think that's true. I think there are aspects about, say, modern culture that are a bit rootless. And I tried to touch on that, this idea of a disconnection with history from, let's say, an elite artistic perspective. But people themselves, it's not to say that people don't like the kinds of modern buildings. They do. It's just a minority, but it's a sizable minority usually. Like maybe a quarter or a third of people might want to see the kinds of buildings that lack ornament, let's say. And why is that? I mean, that's I think that there is a there is something about something that can be maybe a temptation in the youth. If it comes from utility, it's certainly true that there is a temptation to want to think of things as usable objects, things that you can use, because that is a way in which that we satisfy, let's say, needs and appetites. So it could be perhaps that buildings that reflect this speak to some people who really like the idea that a building can be so functional, because to use a building for a certain need um, does that, and also it can relieve you of maybe some duty that you have, right? So like if a building isn't special, if it, I don't want to say ugly, but if it's not beautiful, there's nothing special about it. You don't really have to feel bad if you have to tear it down. You don't have to feel bad if you have to make an alteration to it. I happen to be in where I grew up in Texas, and which is we're all post World War II. And I'm driving around, and there's all these funny examples. Like I passed a Chick-fil-A, and then across the street is the old Chick-fil-A, and it's from 20 years ago. I don't, and it looks a little different, like they changed it up. But there's something about wanting to, you could just abandon something if you don't have that attachment to it, and I think that is tempting to people. And to the comment about ornament, yeah, I totally agree. Ornament is something that is integrated. It can be applied, and it's mysterious in that way. But what I try to say is that often what we do is we ornament a building, we add things to it that we don't have to have. We do this with ourselves, with our bodies, when we dress them or do add jewelry, makeup, those kinds of things, tattoo ourselves. We add things often to make them more special. And it could be said that we attempt to make buildings so that we're not surrounded just by things that are there only for its use. That we elevate a building by adding these things to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, such an interesting discussion. That idea of the style or the ornamentation reflecting the culture, and what does that say? I think it's such an interesting way to think about the buildings that we're creating right now. So the next question is more pragmatic. It says, it's Carl who's asking, can you speak about beauty's relationship to cost and value? Most people look for financial advantage, obviously, especially with someone's home. Can beauty and value directly or through inspiration?
Yeah, cost is something that you can't escape, and it depends, I think, how invested someone is in a thing. That it starts to seem worth a cost. Now, some things that we do that are beautiful, that are ornamented, really aren't necessarily more costly. And it's easier for me to speak from my experience as working in home design. But for example, I know this to be true, at least from the contractors I've worked in the past. But going without moldings, for example. So if you're going to try to do a very minimal look where you remove the moldings and you have just these clean shadow reveals, that requires more labor to do well, and it is more expensive for them to do than if they simply slap on a piece of wood to cover, let's say, the gap between wall framing and a doorway. And that moldings are a unique opportunity, that are actually a way to make things cheaper, in a way that can look good, and that they give the opportunity to put these flourishes on, so that you can actually buy a molding that has a profile on it that costs the same, basically the same as a rectangular a board that has not been profiled. it's almost no difference in cost. So that there are opportunities built into the way that buildings come together just sort of naturally to add these unnecessary characteristics. And brick patterns are similar too. It's not, how much are you really saving if the brick is turned, or if you choose a different brick. Tile is like that. How much is it really, if you make a pattern with something that you're doing, and that pattern, it doesn't necessarily add costs, or it's so marginal no one really cares. It was, I believe Thomas Heatherwick had this. He works on larger buildings, and he would always say with his clients that he felt that he was talking about a 10% upcharge for beauty on, say, projects of big scale, that it was really kind of the final 10% of a construction cost that would get you over from being like a boring or ugly building to something that truly is beautiful. Maybe that's true. And how you convince somebody to do it, I have no magic answer. But I think that wherever you're dealing with clients, where it is part of their mission to make something that is people will like, then you have at least you can there's an opportunity for advocacy. Let's say it's an institutional building, who like a rec center. Well, is it helpful to go to the neighborhood and say, look, the city is wanting to cut this budget so that this building is more efficiently designed in the way that it looks, but look, your building's going to be ugly. Or do you think it's ugly? Or what would you rather have, square footage, or would you have a more attractive building? Maybe they would rather have the additional square footage. I guess it's hard to say, but that might be one way, is to involve the people who are that might speak to beauty because they have to either have it in their neighborhood, or because they have to use it, and try to invite them into the process of advocating for these features.
Interesting. Yeah, one thing I was struck by the architecture profession, because I come from the legal profession, is there seems to be by architects an aversion to color. And that's something I'm seeing. Maybe there's a shift now, like ornamentation and color. And when you showed that image of I think it was one of the last images of that living room with so much art on the wall, I had a visceral reaction of like, wow, I would want to be in that room. What a beautiful space. And it felt so like every object was chosen with a purpose. So yeah, I almost think some of these decisions around beauty, they're like such emotional decisions, but then we kind of rationalize these things after with cost benefit analysis. So it's so interesting to see how architects think through these problems. Yeah, so we have a couple more minutes left, but I don't see, oh wait, one more question. And my computer is here. Okay, so this is the final question. Cultural features create attachment to the space, but how is it possible to create such an attachment to multicultural matters? In other words, can there be a multicultural taste of beauty?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think one thing to remember is that there's always
we lost the volume on you.
Okay.
I can hear you.
I lost
now.
my
Yeah, no,
wasn't
sometimes
fully
when you
charged.
switch on Zoom.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think that's an interesting question. I would start by saying there's always an immediate context. So wherever you're coming from, you're coming to a place that already exists. So any architect can respond to what's already there. And then, as Christopher Alexander, I think, tried to pick out, there even when you're looking at different cultures, there are opportunities for there seem to be qualities, certain aesthetic qualities that people gravitate regardless of those culture. That was part of what he tried to prove through his experiments, is that it didn't seem to really matter what culture you came from if you were given options and you were looking at something. I don't think that style is just culture. So I think that a building can stand on its own, even if you don't know anything about the culture. We've all experienced that. You can go visit a culture that is foreign to you and find it beautiful. There seems to be a universal aspect to that. So I can go to a Catholic church, I can go to a mosque, I can go to a Hindu temple, and if they're beautiful, I can still appreciate that beauty, regardless of what my cultural knowledge is. I don't have to understand what I'm looking at, and I'd argue that's part of the point, is that there's design intent and there's cultural context, but things that are beautiful tend to move beyond that. It's not that those things do add layers, and our experience of beauty is very much about layers of knowledge. We've all had that, when you know something, it adds something to your experience.
Okay, I think we're at the end of the presentation. This was such a fascinating discussion. And also thank you for those who attended and for those who participated. I can see from those questions that, just like me and Ashley, we were really thinking about the images and the ideas in a way that we don't always get a chance to do, right? We're focused in the weeds, and to sort of scale back and think about these bigger philosophical issues is a real gift. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Brian.